well, on my family's behalf, and mine, I would like to express our heartfelt thanks for this touching event in memory of my father, specifically to Doctors Philip J. Landrigan, Kenneth L. Davis, Michael Mulvihill, Roy E. Brown, Stephanie Thacker, Denise Koo, and Eileen R. Solomon. We are thankful for the effort and time in putting together this celebration in my father's life. Knowing that he impacted so many of you personally and professionally helps us continue to move forward and remember the legacy he has left. Today is not a reminder of how we lost a father, a husband, and an incredible leader, but a day to embrace the man who believed in a better world for us all. I personally do not know many people here today, but your presence already speaks volumes and will forever, so sorry, hold a special place in our hearts. When I begin to get sad, I think of how graceful my dad lived his life. He was kind to everyone. I thought I could do this. He was kind to everyone, believed in the good of all people, and always stayed optimistic even in difficult times. I hope everyone can find peace as we remember a great man, and continue to embrace each day to its fullest as he did. I would like to end by reading a quote left to my father on his memorial site from a colleague of his, Mr. Mohammed Shakir Balagoon. You are indeed a bright light that has illuminated public health and epidemiology. I am inspired, fired by your accomplishments. Good night, Steve. Thank you.
And it became a focal point for a lot of attention by the trustees. But little did I know what the trustees meant in those days. I thought that was just terrific. So we were called, Steve and I and a few other medical students, to the Board of Trustees meeting. Now, in 10 years of being the CEO, we've never called medical students to the board. I had no idea what this would mean, and they sat down with us and asked us to talk about the medical school. So we spent 20 minutes dumping on the medical school in front of Gus Levy and all these other notables who had given tens of millions of dollars to the new Mount Sinai School of Medicine, giving them the absolute impression that it was a horrible failure. We weren't invited back. We heard nothing thereafter. We started our rotations in the third year. Our first rotation, Steve and I were in the same rotation groups, was in pediatrics. And I can remember this like it was yesterday. We had, the chairman of pediatrics was a very imposing figure, Horace Hodes. And he appeared to us to be, from the Attila the Hun School of Management and to the right of Genghis Khan. And he takes Steve and I aside and he says to us, I want you two to know something. If you keep this up, you'll never get an internship. Whoa. I mean, were we really being that destructive? But that was what Steve and I were like. It's kind of ironic. Here we sit in an auditorium that's named after my wife and I want to go into that because we were all together in medical school, and Steve goes on to this illustrious career at CDC, and Horace Hodes thought that he would destroy us. But things obviously worked out. I think it was in the first year of medical school that Steve met Lucy. And shortly thereafter, Lucy moved in and became the fifth roommate. And about a year after that, Bonnie moved in too, my wife. Now, Bonnie I had known since 7th grade, so, I finally let her move in. So we were all living together by the end, so it was a kind of a small family. Steve would meet me thereafter every couple of years once I returned to Mount Sinai and he to teaching here. And what was so extraordinary about Steve is the very same progressive values, the very same commitment to people, the very same moral compass was always there, He was, a beacon for anyone who believed that healthcare is a right for the progressive side of medicine. And he was also a person who could light up the room. But our conversations would rarely talk about that in all those years. Our conversations would always degenerate to discussions of basketball. Now, you'll have to tell me this. I believe Steve went out for the freshman team at Princeton in basketball, didn't he?
I believe
he did, because, I ran track at Yale for 4 years, and I know that Steve wanted to be, an athlete at Princeton, but Princeton basketball at that time was like Bill Bradley.
Yeah.
I mean, this was quite amazing basketball. This isn't like, minor league basketball. But we would play basketball, and my God, he had a sweet shot, and he really understood the game. He was a pleasure to watch on the basketball court. So we would talk about basketball, we'd talk about coaching, we'd talk about the two of you, and I would talk about my children. And I coached soccer, he coached basketball. Well, it's been hard to follow the last year. I mean, the tragedy for me and for Bonnie, we would talk about this, was really, really profound. Not just knowing him, but knowing that he had this horrible brain disease. And being brain scientists, that made it all the worse. And I recall that the very last time I saw Steve and we talked, I came home and I said to Bonnie, he's just a little different. But I'm glad we've all come out today to talk about him and to remember him, because he was an extraordinary person who deserves to be in our memory for as long as we're here. Thank you.
It's a sad occasion that brings us all together. This is very hard for me. Steve and I were very close, especially during his undergraduate years at Mount Sinai. We shared many experiences. Lucy was like part of our family. We spent many weekends together. I got Steve to build a fence around my yard in Ridgewood, New Jersey, right?
Yeah.
And under Roy Brown's leadership, Steve and I and my then wife and Stu Silverstein, who was a medical student here in the same class, I trust you remember him, and a medical student from Columbia, Mike Carroll, I think his name was, all went to Africa together, to the Ivory Coast, to examine Biafran children refugees when Steve was a first-year student. Really? That's amazing. Anyway, we had a very bonding experience, I think, during that trip. And it was very enriching and hard to forget. We haven't forgotten it. And Steve went on to go up to what was then called Upper Volta and work in a, is that where he worked in a clinic? Yes. He replaced, he arrived to help sort of have an experience in a clinical setting in Africa. And the minute he arrived, the French physician said, "God, thank you for arriving. I haven't had a vacation in years." So he left. Here's a first-year medical student in charge of clinical medicine in a clinic in Upper Volta. Anyway, Steve had a tough time, but a great experience. And he came back totally yellow because of so much palm oil in his diet, I guess. And it was incredible. Anyway, I felt close to Steve and I have been close from that point forward, and we interacted many times after he left Mount Sinai and went on to North Carolina. We invited him back multiple times to teach in the first-year epidemiology course. I was particularly interested in his experience with Legionnaire's disease in Philadelphia. He was the first guy on the scene, and his paper was all over the press in the United States, taking care of or interviewing people with Legionnaire's disease. Nobody had any idea what that disease was all about. But Steve had no fear. He just plunged right in, you know, with his mask on. He said his responsibility as a clinician was to take care of people. He didn't care about his own health risks and stuff like that. And everybody said it was so scary to go to see these patients, and we didn't know how the disease was transmitted, what it really was, etc. There he was interviewing in depth patients with Legionnaire's disease. So I was very intrigued by that as an experience for the first year students. I was a director of first year course in epidemiology here for more years than I wish to admit. And I invited Steve to come up and give a talk about his experience and his thinking about how you work up an epidemic for which you don't know what the cause is or what anything about the disease was. And he was a wonderful speaker because he made it a problem-solving exercise, you know. He didn't talk to students. He engaged them in the thought process of how you explore something that was unknown and look at patterns of disease and stuff like that. I think at the time we got him up here, we knew a lot more about Legionnaire's disease, but he would present the students with what we know now and what do you next do? How do you handle that information? What are the next steps? Anyway, he was a marvelous, marvelous teacher. And so we invited him back, I don't know how many times, 4 times or so. But it was great. And so anyway, and then we went down, we had dinner with Lucy and met his daughters. And we were very impressed. He knew how to raise children, basketball coach, teach, doctor. He did everything well. You know, he was just, and he was somebody, this is extraordinary, he didn't want the limelight. He did not want the attention. He was a team player, and he sort of hid in the crowd and wanted to be part of the team, wanted to do good, wanted to bring health care to everybody, but he didn't want attention, and sort of interesting. He also didn't want praise in the medical school. Just to follow up on one of Ken's stories about his relationship with Horace Hodes. Steve, despite Horace's sort of scowling behavior at these radical kids, Steve was given honors in pediatrics in his clinical rotation. And Steve said, I don't think there are justifiable criteria for giving honors in this department. So he wrote to Horace Hodes and he said, I don't accept honors because there's no defense for it. There's no rationale for it. So they had this tete-a-tete and they imposed honors on him anyway.